So now, without further delay, let's begin today's event, sponsored by Sisense and hosted by Information Management. It's my pleasure to introduce your moderator for today, and that is Lenny Liebman. Lenny, you have the floor.
Hey, thanks so much. And again, I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar. If you attend these webinars, I won't talk too much about myself. You know my background, both for information management and as the founding partner of Morgan Armstrong. And Internet of Things is very near and dear to my heart for a variety of reasons. One is that it really represents a key technology in terms of the intersection of sort of technical capabilities and what businesses do to increase performance, to achieve competitive advantage, to make their stockholders happy, et cetera, et cetera. So my assumption is that you're here because your company is either starting to consider Internet of Things or has been slapped in the face by Internet of Things, either because of your partners or competitors. So you are really in for an information-packed day. And that's not really because I'm here. That's because we have a great speaker today, Fran Raybuck. And the reason I invited Fran to join us today was really threefold. One is that Fran is really active on the leading edge of Internet of Things, what's going on with, again, the technology and the business side. But the other thing I like about Fran is he is not purely an IoT specialist, but I think he understands IoT in the context of a variety of trends that are going on in business IT and information management that include things like robotics and analytics, et cetera. The other thing I like about Fran is I think he's really at the right balance between somebody who's a visionary, can look forward, but also has his other leg firmly grounded in what's practical and what's going on today, what people are actually doing. And that comes from not only his experience as an industry observer, but also as a hands-on builder of engineering pilot programs. So I'm really looking forward to Fran's presentation, but what we wanted to do, both Fran and I, before we got started, is we wanted to take our audience's temperature in terms of where you're actually at with IoT today. So as our announcer said, you see this poll. I would really love it if everybody who's online with us today would answer this question. So again, we can get a good representative sampling of where you guys are at. And basically, we're asking where your company's at in terms of IoT, and these answers are sort of progressive in terms of how far along you are. So the first is you're just sort of considering it. The second one is you're starting to pilot or evaluate it. The third answer is that you're already maybe doing some kind of analysis and capture of telemetry from some sort of devices. The other one is if you're further along that you actually are actively making these IoT capabilities a core element of your value proposition to your customers and partners. Some of you on here may actually be on the other side of the coin, which is you're sort of manufacturers and developers of the technology, so that would be good for us to know, or none of the above, which I will take as a personal criticism of the failure of my taxonomy that I created here to capture every possible combination of people. So again, click it. Make sure you click the submit button because we would like to get the results. We're going to try to tabulate these in real time. So if you could, again, I'll give you just another minute to do that. And then what we're going to do is, Fran, let's take a look at these results, and we'll look at them with the audience. And you tell me what you think. It looks like, first of all, a quarter of the people refuse to categorize themselves in one of those categories. I think some of them may be academics, too, I saw on here, so that may account for some of that. But it looks like we pretty much have a sliding scale. Were you kind of expecting to see this distribution where, most people were early stage, and then as we go further down, the numbers decrease?
Yes, and in fact, I think what you're really seeing is a true capture of what's happening in the space. People are hesitant to really bring in their business, true business applications right now, so they're mostly in pilot stages. So you're considering it, if you add the two of those up, well over 50% of the audience is piloting and considering it. I'd say that's about where the market is.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm glad we have a nice representative sample then, because I think that's what we prepared our presentation for. And again, I was really looking forward to hearing you spin the story about sort of IoT generally, and I think you've got some industry-specific examples. So why don't you go ahead and get started?
Okay, great. First of all, thank you for inviting me here today, and I'm thrilled to present. Lenny mentioned some of my background, and it goes back to the point in time, I guess, where I think generally most people agree IoT started, and that's with a quote that came out of the RFID world from Procter & Gamble, and they basically coined the term with RFID tags becoming the Internet of Things. I didn't think at that time they realized the scope and the magnitude that this would grow into. And the quote at the bottom there is probably an understatement. I think you're going to see many more things as we move forward, creating electronic skin on the earth, literally. So today, what I want to do is first start out, I always like to define or talk about what is the Internet of Things. And here's a Microsoft sort of map, a layout. Every time anybody presents anywhere or talks about Internet of Things, they typically have a opening slide that connects things like this together, the earth and washing machines and computers and analytics are in there and clouds. Other people see it in a more worldly, graphical sense like this, and this is sort of the cover the earth or earthly view of IoT. Others really see IoT as just an extension of the cloud, and they have a very cloud-centric view of it. And to some extent that's true, and you see receiving devices on the end, you see traditional things like mail being involved, but then you see, trucks and cars and parts and things like that. More sophisticated graphics may start to show lines connecting things. And this is where it really becomes a little bit complicated, because as you start making these connections, you start seeing graphs that show a truck being connected to a washing machine. And, of course, it doesn't mean anything in and of itself. A lot of the graphics are just meant to say that everything and anything and even old things that you use today, computers and tablets and your car and all, will be connected together in some way. I like to think of the Internet of Things almost as a series of ecosystems. First of all, in a very simplistic fashion, the IoT really combines sensors or actuators, connectivity, and business processes and people. The big difference between the traditional world that we have had up to this point in computing, the ERP era, is in the past we were putting in data, we were collecting data, we were summarizing it, we were sorting it, we were exchanging data between our companies, but all the information was typically between computers and people. We're now involving things, and the IoT is really driving this whole fourth industrial revolution, which is a phrase I think was coined really from the World Economic Forum and Davos. They have several series of white papers that talk about this, and it involves things like robotics and 3D printing. But the main thing is that we're connecting things. We're getting new types of applications. And the applications can be as simple as like the Amazon Dash button, where as an actuator you press a button and a message goes through the air or through your Wi-Fi network and goes and orders something, and Tide shows up at your front door within the next day or two. One of the big differences, and I'll reiterate this several times, is data is really the end product of all IoT solutions, and how we deal with it is going to become the driving force. So, again, the new connections is people versus things, and the difference is that the number of things connected is going to far surpass the number of people. If you look at this graph, and the source of this is Cisco, I think was the first that started to show this, they have a very small blue dot in the middle with the gray around it. The gray is the people being connected to the Internet. And as you see, as time progresses, as we get further on out, eventually the number of things connected far eclipses the number of people on the Internet. So data from individual things is small, but collectively it's going to be a huge amount of data with a huge number of things connected. And by the way, these things, that are connected aren't necessarily all connected directly to the Internet, directly connected through an IP. There may be sub-networks that collectively get data and then pass that collection of data forward. So I really think the key thing to understand the IoT space is to think of it as themes or ecosystems. You don't have to know Zigbee or other particular things in the supply chain. You don't have to know RFID if it's not applicable or useful in your particular industry. And I'm going to define about 4 or 5 major categories or ecosystems, I think, that are the central focus of the applications. And once you narrow your scope of IoT down to that industry, it's still a massive amount of information to understand and learn, but you'll find that the standards and the connectivity options and the sensors and the way you deal with data are unique in that industry. In fact, each of the industries are creating their own standards within that sector. Eventually, I think you'll find most of these will open source, or I would expect many of the applications you start to build not just include data from your own sources, but also from external sources, weather data, for example, that you're not going to necessarily collect or measure, but you may need it to do projections for shipping or other applications. And a lot of the applications are going to depend on external data and external APIs sometimes to access that data. So in keeping that in mind, I'm going to start with the first big ecosystem, I think, that is probably one of the main ones that many of you may or may not be involved with, but I think you will be if you're in IT, and that is what I call buildings, or the BIoT. Here, I think there's 2 markets, really, the home market and the industrial market. The industrial IoT, which is a common phrase, is really dominated by buildings that are chemical plants, nuclear plants, typically those types of facilities that are heavy industrial-oriented, manufacturing-oriented. They're not the normal office building per se. Those have their own sector of information and technologies and even competing standards there. And I'll talk more about that in the next slide here. Others, common office buildings that you control, or even your own home, are going to connect different services. And in the past, these were all silo systems. Your HVAC system was monitored from one screen, and your video surveillance was on another. Your fire detection was something else. These are all coming together, and companies are creating complete systems so that you can monitor and detect, is there a change in necessary temperature in this area, and your fire detection system may be triggered in some way as an early predictor that, hey, the heat is going up too much, or maybe there's a security issue there that I need to look into. So it's going to become more and more important, I think, that we have a complete control room. And I think a common phrase, a common equation in that whole industrial space is to really think of IT as the IoT as an equation that is IT, which is your traditional information technology, and OT, operational technology. There's tons of operational technology in the basements of all your organizations somewhere. And you're going to get involved, you're going to partner with them, and together you're going to be growing those systems. Some of the fastest growing segments in this market, I think at least for the next year, is going to be a lot of work in using indoor location services dominated by iBeacons, and I'll talk a little bit later about that. So in the industrial IoT space, we really are combining traditional business data with operational data. We have remote sites that we're monitoring. You're going to have complete maps where you'll be able to judge and monitor and watch all these things if you're not doing it already. And the thing is, gradually these things will merge together. They're not all necessarily operating or need to operate on the same standards. For instance, video and video streaming would be and create a different need for data transfer than would be measuring vibration analysis on some type of machinery in your machine production shop. I only need to have periodic small measurements from those things, whereas on the video, the other extreme, I want to be constantly seeing video information coming there. And by the way, with video is a good example. Data analytics is critical because if you think you can suddenly set up several cameras, and let's say you have 9, and you have a Brady Bunch sort of square, tic-tac-toe square of those things, that's fine. The normal human can process 7 to 9 things. But one operator trying to watch that as you have cameras that are all over your organization, across the country or across the world even, it's not humanly possible to be monitoring all those things at once. That's when you're going to get into data analytics. Data analytics is going to become a common theme you're going to see, that across all these ecosystems, analytics are important. Through data analytics, I can look for images and detect things when people put a case down on the ground and walk away, or I can count people. I can do many things analytically with video images. The other big area is digital health, or the human IoT space. And a lot of this is sort of growing out of the wearable space, where Fitbit and many others started to come out with wearables and watches that would count your steps and measure your heart rate. And probably over the last 6 months or so, there's been some exits in the market. You've had a company like Intel that has shut down their Basis watch that was probably one of the best for monitoring health things. Microsoft exited the market. The Pebble watch was recently shut down. They were one of the original watches, and they were sold to Fitbit. But moving forward, it's not just going to be individuals. These are going to be used in hospitals and clinical settings for clinical trials. One of the biggest things in doing any kind of clinical trial is getting people to do the things they need to do and measure the things constantly. As we have an aging population, it's going to become impossible for us to manage and monitor the huge population of people that are going to have health problems and need to be monitored pretty much constantly over a period of time. And here's an example, actually. This is an actual kit that connects up through a Arduino system, and you can connect it up and capture all this data, data for temperature and breath, and et cetera. There's 10 different things, I think, that it has in this kit that you can measure. Now, obviously, we're not all going to sit around like this, but you're going to have smaller and smaller devices that will connect to us in some way and allow us to either be constantly measured within our home environment or in healthcare facilities. The second big area, I think, is the transportation IoT, or TIoT. And obviously the smart car, smart car isn't the popular term. Everybody's talking about self-driving cars. And self-driving cars is a point that we will reach, and we'll reach fairly quickly. But we already have parts in cars, and we're developing more. And it's not just going to be cars, but it's in all transportation, in rail and shipping and buses. Knowing where all your buses are at any time and which ones are lagging. In fact, if we can start to measure things, and just imagine for a moment, if at a bus stop we had a button, an Amazon button, you could press the button, and it would signal that, hey, I have one person here that needs to get picked up. And I have all these buttons all throughout the city. And if I had data analytics that will allow me to optimize routes, to say, okay, I've got 20 to pick up here and 1 here, then I could start to really dynamically change the transportation system. Why do I need buses that carry 40 to 80 people when many small stops only require 4, 6, 8, 10? We could really optimize the whole transportation system. And even in the infrastructure itself, there's development of V2V, vehicle to vehicle, so cars talk to each other. They know when they're stopping in front of, and we've seen some of the commercials on that, putting things into the highways, into the bridges. Since we've had some bridge collapse, the Minneapolis, I think it's the I-35, They've put new sensors. I think there are 7 to 9 sensors at least in that bridge to detect vibration levels, to detect temperature, the stress, etc. We now have new ways to measure our infrastructure through IoT to allow us to do predictive analytics to say, hey, there might be a problem here, rather than just visually inspecting and looking for cracks. Of course, here's a great slide. You can download the copy of this. But the big change with the smart car, the intelligent car over time, is dramatic. And as you start to look at the things, the effects that it has today and potentially tomorrow, it's going to just change our society. Once we have self-driving cars, we have new ways to commute. We have new ways to think of what's happening inside the automobile. The automobile could become the new portable office. Maybe I don't have an office. Maybe my office is in my car. And some people do that today as salespeople. But we changed the total arrangement of the seating and things like that. I can create a round table in there. I can do other imaginative things, I think, in the car that we can't do today, since we have to keep our eyes on the road. And if you thought you're not really involved in the automotive space, in the transportation industry, you really need to think again, because the impact of self-driving cars is amazing. For example, if all the cars were out there self-driving, we would have less road traffic, actually, because we could optimize the speeds and everybody would go at a consistent level. Also, if it decreases the amount of automobile deaths, the healthcare industry is impacted. And how is that impacted? Well, today, I think about 80% of the organ donations come from automobile crashes, unfortunately. But if suddenly you reduce that source by some large amount, you have a new need and a new way you need to source organ transplants. So I think, when you start to look ahead into the future a little bit, there's going to become a dramatic need for new ways to think about transplants, including artificial type hearts and other organs. One of the biggest areas, and this has become pretty prominent over the last couple months, a big emphasis on cities. And when you hear, the current administration and everybody here in the United States and all over, everybody's talking about smart cities and infrastructure. Well, if all we're doing is just putting more pavement out there and fixing roads and propping bridges up, it's not going to be enough. We're really starting to see the beginning of a new trend in the modern cities where we're monitoring and measuring things. And this data is really interesting because the data becomes crowd-shared with other people and with yourself, so that, for instance, mapping and traffic things can become embedded into applications. And that happens today to some extent. In fact, today, the old way of doing traffic things would be to say, okay, if your current route is blocked, take alternate route X. Well, I think Microsoft was the first to say, well, no, wait a second. If everybody starts to take alternate route X, then the original route probably gets less crowded, or there may be an alternate route Y that's even faster. And they've built into their transportation algorithms now to dynamically count and measure which is the least congested route to your destination. So I talk here, this is from Smart Cities Council. Jesse Burst has started this group, and it's a great site to go to if you're into cities and you want to find out what cities are doing to create sort of a whole IoT or a smart city. By the way, IoT and smart seem to go together. If you're doing something with IoT, it gets smarter and smarter. A company, Labilium, has a map here of all the things that are happening in cities. And when you think about it, these are amazing things that are being done today piece by piece. The new bicycle systems that are being put into cities. Chicago is one of the leading sites, I think, that's actually implementing a lot of these things. But things on light polls and stuff. I was recently at a hackathon out at CES that involved Las Vegas, and they have on all their street posts put sensors up and created open data so that anybody can read those sensors and get information. So again, there's a wide selection of opportunities in cities of measuring different things that can improve the life, it can improve the congestion. You know, it's funny, a lot of the traffic within cities, depending on who you talk to, but 20 to 40% of the traffic is spent in looking for parking spaces. And a simple IoT application that was a bit annoying, but certainly useful and sort of a signal of the emerging trend was out in Vegas. All the garages now are starting to put in smart parking. So when you go in the garage, you know, you go to a certain level, and it will tell you how many spaces are there. And you can pull in and immediately look down and see green and red lights above. And a green light is certainly an open space, a red light is a closed space. They can monitor the cars. They can count the cars that came in. As you exit the space, they can count it. They know when you came to the minute in and when you came out. And you are now paying for that privilege of parking at the casinos at some of the sites out in Vegas this year, which is a bit of a surprise, but sort of a great example of really trying to utilize a space that has, you know, its limited capacity. I'm sure we all experienced the frustration of looking for that parking space either in the city somewhere or even in a shopping mall area or in a garage. Here's a simple example, and this is from some of the friends that I've worked with. Tomas over in Barcelona, Spain, started this movement, and you buy this smart city thing, and it measures various things in the air. And they have a whole application mapping system called smartcitizen.me that anybody who puts it up can then register with the site and send their data up. So this was not one central concerted effort to do something. It's almost like crowdsourcing of IoT. So over a long, worldwide, actually, this tracks worldwide all the sensors that were sold and are being tracked through the system and then geographically mapped here. And then you can start to imagine things where they're averaging things within a certain area and detect potentially pollution pockets that you may want to avoid. But this is just an early sign. And again, this was not necessarily any big organized effort. Imagine if cities and states and around the world we started to collect this information. And I think, you know, very closely associated with driving a lot of IoT things within cities is the big move towards really trying to, you know, look at sustainability overall. At Interop, I was a presenter at one of the sessions they had on IoT. It was a whole day session, but I was talking about some of the key roadblocks, I think, that you may experience or be concerned about. And there are many. Security typically is the one that most people bring up, and that's pretty obvious. I didn't put that on there because I think the systems and organizations will be very aware of these things and hopefully, you know, take security as a number one priority in putting out their IoT space. But data is important. In fact, of all the things I talked about previously, whether it's digital health, buildings information, transportation, or cities, the one common thing they all have is the information and data that comes out of those can be used and analyzed with a multitude of tools. It does not have to be tied into any particular IoT architecture. And the end result of collecting all this data and dealing with the data is for you to make better business decisions and find new revenue opportunities even. One of the challenges, of course, is the infrastructure and the architecture to build some of these things. I think the key thing is, and in our survey, as we saw, about 25 to 40% of the people now are in that phase of building initial pilots and trying to determine what their long-term infrastructure is. The last one, and I don't think this is a roadblock, but it presents a roadblock. Oftentimes people talk about the cost. And the bottom line is before you start any IoT things, you should be looking at your business processes and opportunities to do things. Okay, so some of the growth areas to watch, and these are key things in the IoT space that I think will have a lot of activity this year. There will be many, many different activities happening in each of those major ecosystems that I talked about. But Bluetooth 5.0 is coming out. Coming up is the Mobile World Congress. I expect to see a lot of announcements. I would say within the next quarter, you'll start to see devices coming out with Bluetooth 5.0. What does it do? Basically, it's faster and it has a better range. Pick one. And when I say pick one, I'm saying that even though they're giving you both of those capabilities, and this is actually pretty interesting, you can choose whether you want it to go faster or you want the range. So it gives you the opportunity. We'd like it to do both, but if it does both, then it doesn't have the advantage of being what it does now, and that is being a very low data rate without necessarily filling the airspace with noise constantly. The other sort of emerging area that's been really moving ahead over the last 2 years or so, and you'll hear more and more about this, and this is more related to outside, is LPWANs, or low power wide area networks. And it includes things like LoRa, Sigfox, LTE-M, waitlist, RPMA. I'm not going to go through the list, and there's many more, but these are things that when I made that quote, or inserted that quote in the beginning, that Planet Earth will don electric skin, actually puts us very close to connecting things. It's not unreasonable to think, and so I have some charts that talk about different countries, like in the United States. It compares RPMA, LoRa, and Sigfox, and it shows the number of APs, the number of these devices that would be needed. And you're not talking thousands and thousands. You're talking, under 1,000 in some cases to cover a country. So it's really interesting what's happening here. We'll see how it develops within cities. Finally, the iBeacon market is, and if you don't know what an iBeacon is, really Bluetooth devices that are used in indoor location. We've always had GPS, and GPS doesn't work indoors, and there have been a variety, and there still are other alternatives to finding location of where I am within a building at any point in time. iBeacon is technology that has really come out that is really resetting the whole stage there, and I think you'll see that this market now has 20-plus entrants in it, and they're all actually doing very well in doing the indoor location tracking capability. But I think one of the biggest areas, and it's sort of silent because we typically think of the connectivity options and IoTs and the buttons and things like that, but it's going to grow the market for analytics and visualization of this data and even new user interfaces. One of the dominant things at CES this year was to see that Echo from Amazon was embedded into all different types of IoT systems, into cars, into appliances, etc. So I think really you should be starting to look at revamping and building up your data analytics capability. And this is not just your SQL stuff. This is the AI type people. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Lenny, and he's going to talk about monetization a bit.
Yes, I am, but you know what? You covered so much territory, and I can't help but comment on a couple of things that you said first before I get started. And I think I just want to zero in on something where you talked about sort of how business models are changing. You talked about, for example, the unintended consequences of reducing auto accidents and how that affects sort of as a society how we source organs. I want to bring up just one particular vertical instance that I've been observing lately. And you talked about sort of the quantified self, which is wearing sensors like a Fitbit-style sensor and so on, and also sensors in the home. And if you want to talk about something with large social implications, we baby boomers are driving up the number of seniors, I guess they call it the silver tsunami, pretty dramatically over the next 15 years. And there's definitely a shortfall of senior-specific housing. And also more of us want to stay what they call aging in place, stay in our homes. So not to put a futuristic spin on it, because this is happening right now. If you look at like Masonic Homes of California and a few others are sort of combining sensors in the home, including sort of temperature and motion with sensors on the body. Again, Fran, you talked about it, the idea that there's going to be more people we have to monitor, and even combining it with sort of Amazon Home, like you said, and maybe even a tablet to really do this kind of monitoring of individuals that I know as somebody who has an aging parent, that allays a lot of concern. Did mom fall down? Is she moving more slowly? And with analytics, from what I've been told by the actual practitioners, they've actually started to predict based on changes in motion rate when a senior is probably headed for a fall because their rate of motion and type of motion is starting to change, so they can intervene. And those of us who are, again, familiar with these things know that that one fall is often a seminal moment in somebody's aging history. So that's kind of what the sensors can do if we combine, again, consumer domestic sensors with body sensors. But what's also really interesting, if you're in any business that's related to it, is you'd think, okay, so maybe some senior care facilities, for example, are going to get into this business. But when you actually look at which business it is that's best positioned to install sensors in the home, it's actually the home security business. So there's a really interesting set of changes that are going on in terms of what the channel is for this technology, what the channel will do, how this information can be shared with medical professionals, real interesting ecosystems of information that are being driven by this massive amount of data, and again, the analytics that are applied to it. So I just had to comment on that because, Francis, you just triggered a lot of thoughts. And again, this is not something that's sort of pie in the sky. There's people who are actually doing this right now, and they're using the data to figure out actually what data is useful and what isn't, which is kind of the big problem. So what I wanted to share, because I think, Fran, you also made a great point in one of your last slides about after you talked about the business models, and a lot of people get hung up on this sort of the nature of the sensors themselves, this notion of how this actually happens in a business. And I think what happens in the hype cycle is you get this IoT monetization narrative, which I'm showing you here now, which is, right, you have all these data sources, you do some kind of magic on them, some decision maker gets a brilliant insight, and that just turns into money. So we have to be very careful about telling a story that looks like that, when really the story tends to look a little bit more like this. There are, first of all, a diversity of data sources. And again, as Fran said, some of them may be your own IoT, some of them may be third-party IoT, some of them may be conventional structured data sources, some of them may be unstructured data. There's all kinds of different information that needs to be synthesized in order to make sense of and contextualize these inputs. That is a non-trivial task. And again, as Fran said, it's not like there's a single standard or a single methodology. As a matter of fact, your approach to, first of all, the big problem of data ingest and integration, which is sometimes more of a problem than the analytics themselves, right? I mean, analytic algorithms are widely available. And again, I think a lot of people tend to focus on sort of the algorithmic nature of interpretation. But before you can even do that, you do have to figure out, which sensor is in which of my customers' homes, and if I want to correlate demographic information, I have to go back to my customer database, do something that, discovers, okay, customers having these demographic characteristics, and then relate that back to their sensor information. So there's really a lot of gymnastics there that I would tend to distinguish from the analytics themselves, which is sort of the discovery of patterns and trends and correlations within that data. This can be a pretty massive activity if you do it yourself. Increasingly, we're going to find that this stuff is going to be done as a service in the cloud. But anyway, when we look at this diagram, you can see I've put a lot of emphasis on data ingest, integration, rationalization. We used to call it ETL. We don't always do that now. I've got a red box for analytics. But I want to highlight something that I think Fran sort of mentioned in passing that I think is huge, which is visualization. The visualization component of analytics, taking analytic outcomes and couching them in terms that a non-data scientist can readily understand is extremely important. Now, we've done a lot of this in the BI field, I think, where we see things like sort of creation of heat maps and, three-dimensional use of colors, et cetera, to help decision making. But this is going to become more critical than ever as we are trying to perceive sort of subtle, esoteric relationships between a larger number of parameters, and those parameters are increasing because we're detecting different things. Again, Fran talked about sort of detecting motion, maybe even in a retail environment. I was at the New York Retail Show, and they were showing a camera that could not only detect that I was there, but also guessed or inferred, I should say, my age within 15 years and gender as I'm walking by. So imagine that. You've got a heat map that's somehow correlating age and gender with shopping patterns in a store. So I would not underestimate visualization. I would also suggest that even with great visualization, as we're initiating our journey down IoT, you can see I've got, first of all, multiple stakeholders who all may need different information because one of them is in charge of customer experience, another one's a product manager, and another one's an operations manager. They all have different questions and want to query the underlying data differently. But also, when they receive a visualization, 9 times out of 10, their result isn't an aha moment that's going to suddenly result in a value offering that's going to add 5% to the bottom line. Usually, the initial event is another question. In other words, it's, I've seen this, what does it mean? Or what happens if I ask this? Or what would happen if I would make, do an A-B sort of, what-if scenario? And so what you need to do, you can see the blue arrows underneath, kind of loop back. So you go in, you ask another question, and it's a very iterative process. Data investigation is highly iterative. So I'm sharing all this because I'm trying to disabuse anybody of the notion that you sort of get a bunch of data, you slap an algorithm on it, somebody looks at it, and they make a decision. It's a much more collaborative, iterative process, and of course, collaboration, iteration, ingest, all of this takes time and money, and all our organizations have a finite have these as finite resources. So part of what we're going to learn to do is not just how to do this, but how to organizationally respond to allocating our budget, our people, and our time so that you can start to zero in on answering questions that actually move the needle on the business as opposed to ones that are just sort of interesting questions. And again, I could probably give some great, classic B-school examples of finding out a problem and then it turns out that there's no solution to the problem, so you have to just accept it, right? So one of these is churn, for example. So a lot of companies are always looking for, well, how do I predict churn in the customer? And what happens is you can do a lot of prediction, but it turns out that you can't recover a large percentage of those customers. So you may want to ignore that and focus much more on where am I failing to get a buy decision from a new prospect, which might move the needle a little more. So this is kind of what we're going to start to do as we move past the technology and into the business model. Also, when it comes to visualization, this is a friend of mine. He's got a factory. We were at a football game, and I was talking to him about this, and he whipped out his phone and showed me that he could monitor his 4 assembly lines. Now, this was at a football game, so of course they were not producing over the weekend. But again, when we talk about visualization, we also want to think really about form factor and, again, just showing this guy the data he needs. This is a case where the business case does not require a lot of investigation, and he just wants to know, is the line up and running, and is it up and running sort of somewhere in the green zone? He's only concerned about the extreme of a red line or a 0. And this is a great way that he could whip out his phone and get that information right away, and that's all he needs to do. Again, CEO of a company. So this is what we want to think about too, is sort of how do people actually consume this information. Some of it's going to be very sophisticated data science where we're going to get under the hood of some very complex correlations. Some of it isn't, and we have to be smart about knowing where we don't need a Rube Goldberg machine to solve a problem that can be solved with a hammer. Again, just want to run through these quick because I want to have time for some of our questions. So Fran made the assertion of kind of where Internet of Things started. I think a lot of our lessons actually came out of manufacturing, where we have certainly had sensors all along. And this is just a classic diagram of a manufacturing floor at the base, all the metrics that we capture from it, and how we kind of do this classic increase in productivity by spotting downtime, looking for delay, and taking out defects. And again, this is just a classic example of how you may want to model your business decision to look in your own business, where are the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 pressure points that have the highest impact on the bottom line performance of not maybe the business of a whole, but a particular business function, whether it's selling or marketing or service. We have to be very careful about picking those KPIs because, as we know, if you're running a call center and all you're doing is you're measuring, for example, how quickly somebody can resolve a call, you could be creating a real problem for yourself because what you could be doing is simply having your customers have really bad experiences and just having more of them more efficiently, right? So your metric in a contact center may not be time to resolve. It may be first call resolution combined with satisfaction with that resolution, or does that problem ever come back? And I think, again, in the manufacturing world, we've had a long time to sort of work on this science, and so they provide a lot of good models for that. And I also bring this up because what's interesting in manufacturing, and again, I think Fran touched on this a little bit, is some of us, what happens is we've sort of had manufacturing as a laboratory for taking metrics from objects and turning them into value. And first we looked at efficiency in the last diagram. Now we've started to also take it beyond that, right, where we're starting to look at, of the things that I'm making more quickly, which ones have the highest margin, so that everything is constantly contextualized, so that we're not just sort of fixing manufacturing to fix manufacturing, but we're fixing manufacturing in a way that has the highest impact on business performance and customer satisfaction. And what's interesting is manufacturers themselves, in addition to using IoT, are of course starting to embed intelligence into their devices because they're not just making widgets now anymore. They're making what Fran says we might call smart widgets, or maybe they're just really dumb but highly talkative widgets, right? So they're providing us a lot of information and perhaps they can receive some controls. And this is really changing the nature of IT within our organizations. So whereas IT used to be just we're going to enable knowledge workers to do knowledge work, increasingly we're all thinking about how can we embed technology in the actual thing we do. So if I'm running a seniors facility, IT no longer is just doing payroll and making sure that I'm collecting from the insurance companies whatever percentage of a senior's rent is getting subsidized, however, and doing all those kinds of, making reports and sending out invoices and so on. But we're actually starting to think about how do we embed technology in the senior facility? How do we embed it in a car? And again, Fran went over all of these ideas, but it really changes the role of IT in our organizations. So again, if you're going to download these slides, you could take a look at that one. And Fran also made passing reference to 3D printing. And again, while not necessarily specifically part of IoT as we've discussed it in terms of sensors that generate data from objects, it is interesting to think about as we consider kind of the binary software, digital, ones and zeros natures of objects. Objects themselves are increasingly becoming binary code. In other words, not only can the widget transmit information about itself, but the widget itself has been reduced to a piece of software that can be produced anywhere. So again, pretty major implications. Will those implications be felt in the next 5 years? Not sure. Will they be felt within the next generation? Absolutely. And here's a perfect example of a manufacturer who starts with bit of intellectual property in the top pipeline, tests it, has to ship it somewhere, parts to manufacture, there's distribution and so on. What happens when that can be manufactured directly on the end user's facility? That's the first thing we think about is the speed to market. But the second thing, which I think is perhaps a more powerful implication for those of us who make things, is also the customer can more quickly give us feedback about what we've delivered, and we can incorporate that more quickly into our IP. So these are pretty significant implications for this sort of digital skin, this pervasive softwareization or virtualization of everything and the objects of the world around us as we go from just being people on the internet to being an entire material world that has binary implications. So that is all I think I wanted to share with you to just sort of add on to and complement Fran's really good overview of some specific industries. We are going to get some Q&A, and I am going to ask our sponsor to share with us in a minute. But before we do that, I would love us to do one more poll quickly. And this poll is simply us getting feedback from you about this webinar. If you could check one of these, do you feel more informed? Have we thoroughly confused you, which might even be a better outcome given how sort of confusing this really is? Have we excited you at all? Are you kind of excited about the implications that IoT can have for your business? Are you scared to death that this is going to disrupt you and your company out of a job? Are you a little more skeptical because you're hearing a lot of stuff that's making you think that there's privacy and security and operational concerns? Or none of the above? So if everybody who's on with us could just check one of those. I'm probably not going to give you as much time to check in because I do want to get to some Q&A, and I do want to hear from our friend Ani Manian from Sisense. I'm really curious about immediately kind of what you feel this immediate impact of this was. And I am glad so many of you feel more informed. Nobody feels more afraid, and I don't mind at all seeing the fact that people are more excited too. So that's great. Thank you so much for that feedback. And Ani, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with us because I think your company is doing some stuff that's really relevant to what we spoke about. So Ani Manian is head of product strategy at Sisense, and I'm going to invite you to take the floor for a minute.
Thank you. This was quite wonderful, really. And I know many of you are really excited about IoT and are probably wondering what the next step is. So Sisense, our vision for the market is really simplifying this complexity of data that you see. A lot of this is coming from IoT sources. It's coming from, many other sources, web services, databases, and so on. Our goal is to really provide the simplification in the order of days or hours without specialized IT, all in one single platform. And we do this for, disparate sources. The average business user has to contend with about 30 data sources, and that's not including IoT. Once you add IoT and sensor data, it can actually balloon up quite a lot. And the volume of these sources also increases exponentially. So in the last 2 years, we've created more data than the entire history of the human race. So as data complexity increases, as we see a proliferation of IoT sources, this can be a great ally in taking all that and transforming all of it into actionable insights. One of the interesting things that we've done is not just use IoT devices to consume information and translate that into actionable insights, but also use IoT devices as a way to broadcast these insights, to essentially embed these insights in your physical world. So last year, in June, we actually launched a very innovative program called Sisense Everywhere, where we broadcast your main KPI using an IoT bulb. We installed this in offices, in team workspaces, on factory floors, in call centers, in hospitals, all broadcasting your most critical KPI, and we found a profound effect that it has on people. Similarly, the Sisense-enabled Echo allows you to talk to your data and actually get answers using just voice and plain English. So just want to share that with you, and I'll turn it back over to you, Lenny.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I think that's really interesting about broadcasting KPIs. I know of one company that I'm intimately familiar with, and it's very interesting, software company. When they make a sale, they ring a bell in the development area. And it's so simple, and it's such a powerful way to link business behaviors and align them. So I really like the idea of signals, much as they are in our own body, being transmitted across organizations. So really good to hear that from you. We have a few questions, Fran. We don't have much time. I think if you want to take a couple of these real quick, one of them is interesting, which is this idea of balancing between prescriptive analytics and sort of streaming real-time response. Do you want to comment on whether those two things are mutually exclusive, whether some of them are more applicable in some use cases than others? Because I think it's a very important distinction.
I think really if you look at the two of them, I'm not sure what they mean by balance. I think they're basically the streaming analytics is probably related more towards rapid real-time sensor-type data.
Mm-hmm.
So that type of stuff might get fed and read again and again later and analyzed multiple times in multiple ways, not just going through one particular engine. When you get into the prescriptive, which is sort of a combination of descriptive and predictive, it sounds like you know the paths at the end. So there are end decisions that you need to make. So I think you'd be looking at something different. I think they're two distinct fields, although in general maybe you could feed the streaming data into the predictive. I would see that more into the prescriptive, which would then help determine the outcome.
Yeah, and again, being at the top of the hour, I want to let everybody know we appreciate the questions that you have that have come in, and what we're going to do is we're going to just take those offline. There's something interesting here about banking. There's something here about sort of the sensors getting smarter. I know somebody had a question earlier about sort of just managing the physical infrastructure, because there are implications as you become more dependent on sensors. You may have to put, sort of uninterruptible power, right, where you never did before, or you may need to sort of physically protect something that you didn't have to physically protect before because you don't want the sensors to be damaged. So this idea of hardened systems, secure systems is really interesting. But again, in the interest of time, want to respect everybody's time. Fran, I'm just going to ask you, is there anything else that before we close, maybe 45 seconds, you want to share before I wrap up?
No, but I think we had a broad coverage today. It was great talking about analytics a lot. Even though we're talking about IoT, the key thing is to really constantly be thinking about the numbers, and it's not counting things. It's not adding things up. It's not a CFO view of data. It's a new view of data. You're going to discover things with IoT that you didn't know. You're going to discover and find new patterns. You're going to define new businesses even. And that's where it's important. And the visualization, I love the way you're talking about that. In fact, the biggest market now you see is the big movement in VR and AR. And, the guy that held up at the baseball game a little gauge thing, I would guess in the next year he'll be able to visualize his factory itself. Yep. And be able to go and look at the particular, gauge itself potentially and move around in a 3D spherical panoramic view of it. Yep. I mean, that's where we're heading.
I agree that and again we can talk about the future. The future is very exciting, but I think we're all kind of taking some initial steps now. So I appreciate our attendees joining us today. So you can think about taking those next steps. I thought Ani said something very good. This idea of even doing something as simple as taking a KPI and promulgating across your organization is a small step you can take that can really have potentially large behavioral impact. So again, got your questions. If you have any other questions that you want to ask us, I think Ani and myself and Fran, we're all available on Twitter. You can find us there. We'd love to continue the conversation offline. And if you found your time valuable with us today, check your mail. Check the website for more information management webinars. We got a lot of great stuff coming up, and I hope to see you then. Have a great day.